Hello, I'm Diane Kresh, Director of Arlington Public Library. Welcome to Arlington Reads 2021. Sponsored by the Friends of the Arlington Public Library, Arlington Reads brings authors and leading experts to our community to speak about literature and the important issues of our time. This year's theme is Food for Thought, offering perspectives of many authors on a range of national and global issues, including fraught debates about immigration, which have previously strained relations with Americans of Muslim descent, and more recently, occasioned acts of violence against Asians. Here to illuminate one immigrant's experience is our guest, Laila Lalami. Laila was born in Rabat and educated in Morocco, Great Britain, and the United States. She is the author of 4 novels, including The Moor's Account, which won the American Book Award, the Arab American Book Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in fiction. Her most recent novel, The Other Americans, was a national bestseller and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award in fiction. Her essays and criticism have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Harper's, The Guardian, and the New York Times. She has received fellowships from the British Council, the Fulbright Program, and the Guggenheim Foundation, and is currently a professor of creative writing at the University of California at Riverside. She lives in Los Angeles. Her new book, a book of nonfiction called Conditional Citizens, was published by Pantheon in September 2020. It was included on the long list for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. The Other Americans is about the suspicious death of a Moroccan immigrant in California, which sets off a chain of events that reveals a family's secrets, a small town's hypocrisies, and the ties that bind people together. It was a national bestseller, a Best of the Year selection by NPR, Time, The Washington Post, and Variety, and was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the 2019 National Book Award in fiction. A writer of abundant heart and compassion, in the words of Viet Thanh Nguyen, author of The Sympathizer and also an Arlington Reads author, Laila Lalami is a writer of uncommon conviction and tremendous insight. Please welcome Laila Lalami. Hello, and welcome Laila Lalami. We're delighted to have you with Arlington Reads 2021.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to talk about a couple of your books, but I want to start with how's it been going since March of last year for you and your family and your work, and how have you been coping with the pandemic?
Well, it's been a tough year. It's been tough on so many levels, personally and even professionally. But on balance, I feel very fortunate because we're all still healthy. Nobody got sick in my family. So from that perspective, I feel very grateful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been, we've struggled a little bit with getting the libraries open, and we lost a lot of staff. I mean, people didn't come back to work and took other jobs. And so it's been a struggle, but I realized the family losses, a lot of people have lost family members too. And did I read that your father died last fall?
He did. He passed away September 1st. So it's just been a very rough year. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Condolences to you and your family.
Thank you.
Parents are both gone now, and it's a very different experience. And again, please accept our condolences.
Thank you.
So let's start with The Other Americans, which I read after I heard you do an interview with Pamela Paul of the New York Times Book Review podcast, which is something I listen to fairly faithfully, and thought it would be exactly the kind of book I like: interlocking stories, multiple narratives, plus a detective story embedded in there. And so what prompted you had the Moor's account preceded it, and I understood that was heavily researched and a very intricate story. So how did you move from a heavily researched story to something that's detective, mystery, relationships?
Yeah, very deliberately. What happened was I had just turned in the copy edits for the Moor's account, and I felt just tired because I had spent 5 years doing so much research and being immersed in a very formal voice, because the novel was told in the first person, and it was the voice of a 16th century man. So it was like this whole sort of act of ventriloquism that like lasted 5 years, and I wanted a break. I wanted to do something contemporary, and I worked on a dystopian novel for a bit, and it wasn't working, so I set it aside, and then it was summer and I went on vacation, and I happened to be in Wyoming, and then my sister sent me a text saying that our father had taken gravely ill, and so we had to scramble and get on a flight and go to Morocco, where I was born and raised, and where my parents still lived. And so then we went to see him, and he got better, but during that emergency, I got to really sort of apprehend some of the consequences of a decision I had made more than 20 years earlier, which was a decision to stay in the United States. I had met someone. I had come here as a graduate student, but I met an American, and then we got married, and then I decided to stay in the US. And so it was, the story came to me at that point, and it also happened to be a summer where there had been a number of hate crimes against Muslims in the US. So the two kind of strands sort of came together, and I decided to write this novel that uses both of that, a bit of the personal and a bit of the political, and combine them into this mystery, love story, and family.
Right. So there's also a very strong element with the mystery of a police procedural. I happen to be a huge fan of police procedural. I've read many. And I was just curious, how did you prepare for introducing that element into the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had never written mysteries, but I had grown up, actually, when I was growing up in Morocco, every summer, that was what I read. I read a lot of mysteries, a lot of Agatha Christie and Rex Stoughton, just different writers. And as a genre, I loved it, but I hadn't been keeping up with it in adulthood. And so when I had the idea of working on this book, I emailed my good friend Todd Goldberg, who's a crime writer. And I said, Todd, can you recommend what I should be reading? This is what I'm working on. Do you have any recommendations? And so he sent me a list of writers to try out. And I went back and did a lot of reading. One of the authors he recommended was Pete Dexter. I don't know if
I love Pete Dexter. Oh, right. Yes.
Oh my God. I mean, I started Paris Trout, and then I kind of fell down a rabbit hole and got all of the other books and started reading all of them. So that was one of the authors. I went back to some of the sort of classics, Raymond Chandler, for example, Chester Himes.
Sure.
So I just read a lot of those. And what I tried to pick up on, and hopefully I have in this book, is sort of how to unfold different pieces of evidence to keep the story going. I think that's what I found to be the hardest, and not having any particular background in police work. That was really one of the challenges. And as I began to work on the book, I was just really struck with the irony that I had decided to write a book that was set in the here and the now in 2014. And yet within, in short order, I was having to do research anyway. So my plan to write a novel that did not require research was really very naive, because I ended up having to research it. I ended up having to meet with police officers and talk to a prosecutor in the DA's office. And, so it did end up having to involve a lot more research than I thought it would. And then, of course, combined with reading a lot of crime fiction. Those two things really did help me in sort of conceiving that part of the novel.
Right. And you also introduced 9 different narrators, which I actually loved because I like interlocking stories and seeing the different perspectives. Did you begin the novel with that intention to have multiple narrators, or did that evolve?
I had initially, when I first thought of the novel, I had 3 perspectives in mind: that of Nora, the daughter, Jeremy, who's her childhood friend and eventual love interest, and Coleman, the detective. And the reason that I did it from that I thought of the novel in 3 perspectives was because, again, I was trying to kind of get away from that first person narrator that lasts for like 400 pages. I was trying to experiment and do something different. And I thought, oh, I'm going to do different characters, but I'm going to do them in the 3rd person. So it was 3 characters, but it was in the 3rd person. Mm-hmm. And I wrote 2 drafts and I finished the book. And then I turned it into my editor. And when he read it, he thought that he was very complimentary. He was very nice. And he had just some small notes about some of the jazz in the book. But he did ask me about the intent behind having these 3 characters. Mm-hmm. And what I had wanted was to have characters who, in a sense, feel very alone, and to sort of juxtapose their different solitudes. And so he asked me, if that is your intent, why did you stop at 3? You can sort of achieve that effect with some of the other characters that you've included. And so just with that question, I went back and I looked at the book and I thought, oh my God, that is what is not working, because I had felt that the book wasn't quite working yet. And so when he asked me about the choice of perspectives, it kind of got me thinking. And I thought, well, let me just see if it works better this way. And so I went back and I wrote 50 pages. And in those 50 pages, I went into the 1st person point of view, and I again used those same 3, but I decided to use, for example, the mother. And I was just kind of letting myself be guided by instinct, really. And before I reached even the end of the 50 pages, I realized that it was a lot more fun. And it really opened up the book for me. It opened up the stories. It opened up so many narrative possibilities. And it really made me realize how I had written a book in which almost all of the characters that play a significant role were in some sense had experienced a form of dislocation, whether it was internally in the US, for example, with the detective who moves from DC to the desert, or whether it's the vet who deploys to Iraq and then comes back, whether it's Nora who moves to Oakland and has to go back. So all of the characters had that, and I hadn't seen that. I didn't see it really in that draft, and it was there all along, but it was only in doing it in the 1st person that I really kind of started to see that in the narrative, and I decided to go with it. And so the book kept expanding. And by the time I finished writing the 3rd draft, I had the 9 narrators, and then it kind of got a little bit overwhelming. So it took a few more drafts to kind of to complete the narrative. But it was really a very interesting journey in terms of writing the book, because it started out in some ways so different in terms of the choice of point of view, but it is the exact same book. Like, the events are the same, the characters are the same, everything is the same. It's just recast in the 1st person in the end.
Right, and each of the characters, you touched on this a second ago, each of the characters has an element of otherness. The other Americans, their otherness is particularized to their experience.
Right.
But I was curious about how much political rhetoric or the mood of the country around issues of immigration, as you continue to develop the storylines of each of the characters, how much that backdrop played into some of the choices that you might have made, or did it?
I would say not really. The only reason for that is that I started working on the book in 2014, and I think I finished at the end of 2018. So it was 4.5 years. And, you know, I've lived in this country more than 25 years, going to be 30 soon. And I've really had a chance to see immigration debated in many different ways over the course of these 3 decades. And one of the things I've realized is that people always talk about it as though it were a timely theme of the here and the now, but it is something that it's the story of immigration, the story of migration in general is a timeless one. It's as old as humanity itself. People have moved from one place to another for as long as there have been human beings. You know, even some of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves as a species involve migration. So if you think about like Adam's fall from Eden, or if you think about Moses' journey through through the desert, or Muhammad's Hijra, you know, into Medina. So there's all of these stories involve moving to where it is safe to live as a people, as a community, and sometimes even as a species. So I think that you know, migration to me is a very, very timeless theme, and you can see all the time in literature. So when I was working on this book, yes, of course, I heard what was going on in the news every day, for example, with differences, like a different policy that might be announced, or a new appointment at DHS, or, you know, all of these things I did hear about, and sometimes I did write about. I wrote essays about these things, but they didn't necessarily make their way into the novel. And the reason that they didn't is because my characters aren't necessarily, I mean, my characters aren't me. You know, most people don't spend their lives tethered to the news and keeping up with what is happening minute by minute, you know. So just because I'm checking the news all the time about immigration doesn't mean that my characters are doing that. And so I really try to write about that from the perspective of ordinary people who, yes, may be exposed to what's happening in the news, but it isn't something that occupies a huge amount of their time. They're far too busy with living the reality of that dislocation, of that migration, rather than actually thinking about it from a news or a policy perspective.
And there's also a strong thread of history, and clearly the research that you did for the Moor's account, but just the role of history and understanding place and understanding the roots of a story, you know, the migration story, which you said is as old as Adam's departure from Eden. How important is that, do you think, for authors to be researching and studying history and bringing that into their personal or situational accounts?
I mean, I don't know about other authors, but I think for me, it has proven to be valuable and in some sense really central to what I do, because one of the things I realized during the course of writing the Moor's account is how we take facts, like events that happen, and weave them into story and eventually into history. And we take history to just be true, to be real, to be the only story. This is how it happened. And in fact, there's never, history is malleable. History is that changes just like stories change. So you can have the exact same story of Cabeza de Vaca, for example, of his arrival in Florida and what happened to him. And you can tell that same story from the perspective of the enslaved man from Morocco, who's my character, and you would end up with a completely different history of North America if that had been the history that was recorded, except it wasn't. So, you know, that was one of the things that really came up for me during the writing of the Moor's account. And when I started working on the other Americans, I think it was very natural that I began to sort of put these characters in a larger canvas of what is happening, what happened before and what might happen in the future. So for example, a lot of the landscape, like a lot of the landscape, for example, where the accident happens in the story, and some of the other locations in the story name actual streets in that area that are named after native tribes. And so that was kind of a sly reference to the history that was there before the settlers arrived, before the other characters arrived, and then before the Moroccan immigrant arrived. So it's kind of like it's a place that has had many people living in it. And each set of people have had to figure out how to get along as a community. And in this particular book, the community is shaken because this immigrant is killed on the first page.
And might we also say that in some sense we're all other Americans, you know, trying to find our place in community, trying to get along, trying to connect and build bridges? Is that also part of what the novel is trying to do?
I think what the novel is engaging with is the feeling of otherness, the feeling that we all have, that we can be other to ourselves, that we are outsiders. Like if you ask people, are you an outsider? And oftentimes you hear yes, because, and then they come up with ways in which they perceive themselves to be outsiders. That is what the novel engages with, these feelings, which cannot be argued with because they are deeply felt. Now, whether they are actually outsiders in a grander sense, that is a question that I think would be up for debate. There are certain people who are very much privileged in our society. There are very much people for whom history has been written in a certain way that puts them placed at the center of the story. So if you open the newspaper, for example, in the morning, the stories that you see reflected are the stories of the rich and the powerful, and particularly the powerful, really politically powerful or culturally powerful or financially powerful. So if, you know, it makes no sense to say that people like that are outsiders, right? Because all of our lives are kind of affected by them and by the centrality of their story. What the novel is doing is actually like exploring the emotional feeling of otherness more than the objective reality of whether somebody is other or not. So there is kind of a difference there.
Okay. Well, I got totally hooked by all of the characters, and it was one of those books where I put it down and I want more. I want to know what happens after. So I think it's terrific and terrific on many levels. So it was a pleasure to read, and I continue to press it on friends as a must read, particularly as we deal with complicated issues of otherness and dislocation, as you just described so beautifully. So I want to move a little bit to Conditional Citizens, the book of essays that was published last fall. I again read about it and grabbed it and read it immediately. And a little bit like, again, what were some of the motivations for pulling that collection together?
So this was a book that started in 2016. It's really kind of interesting to me to think about how books start, because oftentimes I don't even realize that they're going to be books, right? It's just like the idea comes. And I remember the Democrats were having their national convention in Philadelphia that summer. And at one point, a couple named Khizr and Ghazala Khan came to the stage to eulogize their son and advocate for Hillary Clinton. And I was just really struck by everything that happened around that event, by both the sort of embrace that people had for that many people had for that couple, but also the rejection that the couple was subjected to on the part of many Republicans. So, for example, the wife was said to be silent because something, and her husband maybe didn't let her speak, or the son was accused of being a jihadist. It got very ugly.
Right.
And I was just struck by these two reactions, like the absolute embrace the Democrats had of that couple, and the just sort of like hatred towards them from the other side of the aisle. And it really made me see that even though they were both citizens, in some sense they were conditional citizens, meaning that their belonging to this country was subject to a particular kind of behavior, to silence and to acquiescence and to allegiance. But if they said something critical, as they did, about the Republican nominee, then their belonging started being questioned. And so I wrote a column for The Nation about that, and it was called Conditional Citizens. And I just kept thinking about these boundaries of belonging and how they are negotiated over the course of one's lifetime, not just for naturalized citizens or immigrants, but also just for people who, again, may not feel that they are at the center of the story. So, for example, people of different races or different genders, or people of different ability, like how they negotiate boundaries of belonging within America. And so I wrote a few essays beginning in 2016. And once my novel was turned in for copy edits, I decided to sort of expand on these essays and kind of put them together in one book, which is called Conditional Citizens.
Right. And it appears as if people who are subjected to this kind of scrutiny, it happens again and again, and like it doesn't go away. Like it's not one and done. Oh, now you're accepted and it's all right. It seems like you have to keep meeting a series of thresholds,
right?
Largely driven by political events or terrible things that happen, and then a community of people is branded as a result. Right. So your own citizenship, you are a citizen. And what was your motivation for becoming a citizen of the United States?
The short answer for that is love. I met somebody when I was in graduate school. We fell in love, yada, yada, yada. We were married. And then, I had the opportunity at that point, after having lived here for a certain number of years and submitted to background checks, and you turn in your tax papers. I mean, it's kind of like all these hoops. And eventually I became eligible to become a citizen, which I did in the year 2000. And that was another reason for writing the book, because by the time I started thinking about writing the book, it was 2018, and I was coming up on the 20th anniversary of my becoming a citizen. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. How has my experience of belonging changed, or how has it evolved over the course of 20 years? And when I became a citizen in 2000, I sort of had a crash course, because like a couple of months after I became a citizen, George W. Bush was elected, and then the September 11 attacks happened. And we all know kind of what happened in this country at that time around issues of allegiance, around issues of criticism or being critical of the government. There was a lot of rank nationalism and people wanting you to just say that you supported whatever the government did. And if you were mildly critical, then suddenly, your allegiance would be called into question. And it's interesting because closing on by the time the book was published, which was around 2020, September 2020, we had begun to see a completely different event, which was the pandemic. Right. Completely different from 9/11, has nothing to do with war. And yet the effect that it had on the country once again showed the fragility of belonging for many people who are non-whites. So, for example, Asian Americans have been, in the last few months, subjected to the most heinous rhetoric and to physical attacks, as we've seen in Atlanta and elsewhere. And what's interesting about that is that just a few minutes ago, you were saying how those that questioning of belonging doesn't stop. I mean, in the case of Asian Americans, for example, that question of belonging has a really long history. It is one of the communities that has been subjected to some of the most restrictive immigration laws in the history of the U.S. So, for example, in 1882, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then in 1917, the Asian Exclusion Act. So they have not had access to citizenship by law. And when they did have access to citizenship through birth, oftentimes did not have access. They could not live in white neighborhoods, could not join white schools. I mean, there were plenty of discriminatory laws against Asians. And so when that began to change after the reforms that were passed in 1965 to immigration laws, there was a period of time when things changed for Asian Americans. But here we are 50 years later, and an event like the pandemic reveals how that belonging, in fact, was never entirely secure. It took the pandemic to show some of the cracks in right. that belonging. So it's, to me, it's something that really requires that kind of belonging is always negotiated. Like the boundaries of citizenship are always debated and negotiated, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in overt ways, as happens with immigration laws.
So we're a library and we promote diverse opinions and the works of diverse authors. And is there a more active role libraries can take in helping people understand one another, the concept of otherness, what to do about it? And I'm serious about, you know, other authors that we can be sharing and promoting and assertively making sure are part of our reading programs and our conversations.
I mean, I think libraries play such an important role in citizenship in general, just because if you think about how libraries function with respect to someone like me. I mean, I remember that when I was applying for citizenship and having to study up on the citizenship test and having to have access to the library where you could get these resources to study for the citizenship test. Or if you think about how libraries sometimes serve as places where people can vote. I mean, libraries are like community centers. They're there to serve the community. And so regardless of, you know, everything having to, any markers of identity that you have, whether it be race or gender or ability or paperwork or all that, libraries are supposed to serve everybody. So I think that they are just they play such an important role from that perspective. In terms of authors, of who to promote in reading programs, what I would urge is to really think in inclusive ways about each program. How can, for example, reading programs or events really represent the communities in which the programs are happening, or represent the sort of larger American community? So discussions about, discussions about, say, for example, current events. Are these discussions including as many diverse voices, basically voices that actually represent what America looks like today? So these are questions, and I don't think that it's kind of a single event. Like, I don't think it's a question of just doing one thing and then it will help fix this problem. I think it's more of a journey. It's kind of like a continual engagement with diversity of voices that is going to get us there.
Well, I think you're right. I think it is a journey, and I think it's part of the American experience to want something quick, one and done, and we'll solve that problem and moved on. But certainly, if you're talking about race, black, white, immigrants, the immigrant experience that you just outlined for Asian Americans that isn't new, it's longstanding, and we can probably point to any number of groups who have suffered the same, the LGBT community. I'm just always looking for ways that the library can be a participant in change and helping to break down barriers and increase communication. And I'm hoping that that's what we're directing our energies toward. Please.
Well, one thing that I have found that has helped me as a person is oftentimes when I encounter, like, say, for example, something that's happening in the news, is to look for, like, what is the wider context for this? Right. Like, what is the history behind that? That's why I've become such a such a history, not just because it's like by placing a current event or anything that like a program in a wider context, then oftentimes it's so much easier to have an intelligent discussion, to have to actually get somewhere with that discussion, as opposed to just, especially these days with social media where people are kind of just like yelling at each other all day long and nothing gets really achieved. That it's so much more fruitful to look for each event, to look for, like, what is the wider context that we're dealing with here. It's not just about what's happening right now in Atlanta, but it's about, like, what is that history behind that? How do people get these ideas in their heads?
Right. I think, yes, it's uncovering the systemic causes of why we're here at this point in 2021. These things just didn't happen. They've been building, and they have roots in many areas of economic and social, et cetera.
Right.
You're also a teacher, UC Riverside, and you're a professor of creative writing, but you also have a background in linguistics. And how has your background in linguistics helped you as a writer and as a teacher?
Well, you can see in Conditional Citizens, almost all of the essays, I think all of them, have begin with, like, kind of like an anecdote, but basically looks at a particular word or a particular expression that was used and interrogates it. And I think that really did come from having had that training in linguistics. So even though I did a master's degree and a PhD in linguistics, but I ended up deciding to leave the field and just and write my novels, that training never left me. And I think that it ended up being useful, for example, with these essays where I interrogate so much of the language around citizenship and immigration. With respect to my teaching, it is also something that I think I bring into the teaching. It's this attention to how language is used, to nuances of semantics or syntax in the teaching of writing.
And what's it like been to teach over the last year of the pandemic and distance and Zoom, and how have you been able to maintain those connections with your students?
It has not been easy, just because we're constantly looking at devices. Prior to the pandemic, I had already I had grown extremely concerned with how so much of our human interactions were mediated by corporations. So, for example, if I wanted to tell my husband to stop by the fish market before coming home, it's like you're texting on your device, or, if you're telling a friend, it's by email, or, interacting with strangers on social media. And this was pre-pandemic. I was already disturbed by how much of everything that we did was mediated by corporations. And then the pandemic happened, and we kind of went even deeper in that rabbit hole, where even with talking to students, I'm actually talking on a camera and seeing, like, a bunch of thumbnails. And of course, not all of them are on. So when you're teaching, so some of them are on and some of them is just like black squares. So it just feels strange, and then eventually you get used to it. Like anything else, you get used to it, because we're human beings, and so we're creatures of habit. And I've had to do things like come up with icebreaker exercises. So at the beginning of each class, like just come up with like a fun question that has nothing to do with creative writing, but it has to do with who you are as a person. Like, you know, what's the most trouble that you got into as a child? Or, you know, and then you hear funny stories, and it's the way to kind of get the students to talk to one another and to me, and to try and replicate the kind of chit chat that they might have when we're on break, you know, or, you know, which we don't now because everything is on screen. But if you were in a real life environment, you would walk into the classroom, they would be chatting before the class starts. So I just try to come up with ways to bring that back into the session. And then the rest of it is just like a lot of technology, a lot of using of breakout rooms and emails and, you know, communicating exclusively through that. So it has been a challenge. On the other hand, it has also been an exercise in empathy because you know, I know we at UC Riverside, we are a Hispanic serving institution. Many of our students are first generation college students. People have had to, already before the pandemic, they were working while they were going to school. So, you know, having to suddenly, you know, be forced to support your family, or conversely losing your job and having to go to school at home and your Wi-Fi is not reliable. So there's just like all these challenges that the students face. And so it's been an exercise in empathy and understanding that there needs to be more of that in the classroom, a little bit less emphasis on, you know, has this particular deadline been met to the second, and a bit more of like understanding of what people are going through and being more forgiving of those things.
Well, I think we could all use a little bit more empathy in realms in addition to the classroom. I think that's something there have been many powerful acts of humanity that we've witnessed in our communities, particularly as the pandemic got underway, and people were had rent problems and they had food issues, and even though the libraries were closed, we engaged a lot in working to make sure that people didn't go hungry, and so it stretched us in new ways, and I think brought us even closer to the core mission of what it is we're supposed to be doing. So go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that it's funny because all of the zombie movies and television series were trying to make us feel as though when the zombie apocalypse happened, that basically people would be attacking one another, and it would be survival of the fittest, and it would be very violent and bloody. And what ended up happening is people organized in, you know, mutual aid, gave to food banks. You know, the opposite happened. And I think that's what really, that's where I find my greatest inspiration, is that even though this has been such a difficult time, people still did things for one another. So it was really wonderful.
There were remarkable gestures of generosity and goodwill. And if we could just hold on to that, not just in times of crisis, but as a regular value that we all contribute to. As we wind down, I'm curious about your reading habits and whether the pandemic has been an opportunity to catch up on reading, or did you discover an author you hadn't read before and it opened new doors?
You know, it's interesting because when the pandemic first happened, what I found was that I had a really hard time focusing on one thing. Normally, I read about a book a week. So in a normal year, it'd be about 50 books a year. Sure. And during the pandemic, I did not read anywhere near that. I must have hit maybe 30. And what I also found difficult is I would start a book and within like 100 pages, I just couldn't continue and I'd pick up another. I had a hard time focusing. And then towards the end of the year, towards the end of 2020, I don't know, I guess maybe at that point acceptance kind of set in, and this this realization that this was going to take a lot longer. And then I kind of slowly went back into my reading habits. So I have my little sort of like notebook for every day, and I often will write down what I'm reading so I can actually tell you what I've been reading. I've been reading a lot of like fiction and nonfiction. I've read a biography of Hannah Arendt. I've read called On Love and Tyranny, The Life and Politics of Hannah Arendt, which was really interesting. I've read, let's see here, Guantanamo Diary by Mohammed Oldslahi. I mean, just a bunch of nonfiction. And then a lot of excellent fiction, The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell. And then stuff I have to read for class, like The Metamorphosis. I was teaching it 2 weeks ago, so I had to reread it. Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee. I also taught that, so I reread it. So things like that. So a mix of stuff I have to teach, nonfiction, and then just pleasurable fiction.
Your experience is not unique. Several friends of mine who are voracious readers had the same issue of not being able to concentrate, and then finally acceptance and you realize we're still in this, and so we just have to kind of move on and be as resilient and as adaptive as we can. So this has been delightful, and I love the books that we've been talking about. What next project, or have you started a next project, or you don't know yet, or how does that typically work for you?
So remember earlier I said that in 2014, after I turned in the Moor account, I worked on this novel and it wasn't working, and I set it aside. Yeah. So I worked on 2 books, and now I went back to that one, and I think maybe this time might be the right time to give it a try. So I'm that's what I'm working on now.
Well, we look forward to talking to you about that book when it's published, and whichever one you decide to complete. But this has been a terrific conversation. Again, The Other Americans and Conditional Citizens, books that should be on everybody's to-do reading list. And this has been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for giving your time and showing the way with empathy and heart and compassion. Again, it's something we could all use more of. So thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me.